Hello and welcome to Mike's Garage. These look pretty bad, but anyway, please, if you're enjoying our videos, don't forget to subscribe. That way you'll be notified every time a new one comes out. In our last video, we finished taking this transmission apart, and sadly, it's really in bad shape and everything needs replacing. Which is what's going to happen. It's getting a new case, a new gear set, a new everything. But what I said was I would still continue to put this thing back together just so you could see how that's done. If you've seen it before and you know, maybe you don't want to bother to watch. But if you haven't, this is how they work. We would, of course, do a much finer job were we putting a nice transmission together. This one is getting assembled for demonstration purposes only. So let's get started. First thing is to install the main drive gear, final drive gear, fourth gear, whichever you want to call it, it's all the same. There's a ring right here, a spacer ring that goes on the gear first, and then all of these rollers. Now, when you're installing one of these and you're doing a really proper job, all of this stuff has to be fitted as per the dimensions in the book. And this bearing race, if necessary, has to be sized to these rollers. That can be done with a line honing system, much as I used on that Evo motor case, or it can be done on a Sun and Hone. Whatever your machine shop has and can use, that's what normally happens. I can do both here. But anyway, you take some grease, put all those rollers in place. Now, one of the things guys do when they don't fit properly is they'll leave one roller out to make the whole thing fit rather than size the race. I don't agree with that. I don't do that. But it appears that's what's been done here. So we're going to install it just the same. We put all those rollers on with a little grease to hold them in place. And now we've got it on. The next thing would be the spacer. By putting the spacer on there, and before we're done, we will put in a cork and seal and all that stuff. We're not going to do that here because we're not going to waste a new seal and cork or any of that stuff. Not even the L key, which goes here, which we've shown how to do on other videos. But we're going to put the sprocket in place. The reason for putting the sprocket in place is to hold this beast in place while we assemble the main shaft. Now remember, that nut is a left-hand thread. So by going counterclockwise, we are tightening it up. And there it is. And it's in place. Now I'm going to install this other stuff here, and it's not going to be as pretty as I like to do things, but okay, this is our first and second gear on the main shaft. This is all our ball bearing and the outer race, which seats in the transmission case. Now, when we install this through the case, that's when we put on third gear. Because of this boss here in the case, that gear has to come off the shaft before the shaft can be removed, and the shaft has to be installed in the opposite order that we did that. The next thing onto the shaft is a spacer washer, which, as I said before, we would be using a new one. That goes on next. And then goes that wonderful snap ring I was fighting. And I'm just not going to put a new one on there for the purpose of assembly. And the last but not least is a shifter dog. Now this is the third, fourth shifter dog. It's the one that goes on the main shaft. And it's stamped with a little word right here on its face that says high. High. What that actually means is it must face high gear, or your final drive gear. So it goes on in the direction that this little word faces the main drive gear. So we'll slide that on the shaft. Now that it's on the shaft, we can slide it into the main drive gear. And very carefully now, we'll get that third gear on. And the spacer. It's all going together just dandy. And of course, last but not least, let's not forget that little snap ring that gave me so much grief in the last video. Really funny when you're trying to demonstrate something and it gives you a lot of grief. It's really, I have to laugh at it. Okay, so we're going to rotate that until we get that snap ring started on there, and it'll go on. There we go. Ouch. You can see that snap ring in there giving me a rough time. And it's on the shaft now. Now if we rotate it around, make sure it's on all there. Then we can get the shifter dog onto the same shaft. There it is. And we can slide that stuff all together. Now, this seems a little bit brutal, and I suppose it is. But by hitting this with a large hammer, a large dead blow, as in soft, we can get that bearing housing into the case. And it is now seated in the case. So now we can put the big retainer plate on there. See if I can get my head in the way of the camera again. That's my job. Now we get all four of these in. Now see, I thought I could just set it in place and it would just slide right in there. But no. Okay. So now we'll get all four of these screws in here. And once the whole thing is assembled, then we can go over it and tighten everything up the way it needs to be. It's hard to tighten this nut here with the shaft spinning, yet you can tighten it very easily with the counter shaft installed, because you can simply put it in 2 gears at once and it'll hold it still for you. So there it is. We now have the main shaft installed. Now when we're doing this for real, like I said, you'll use a new snap ring to hold third gear in place and a new spacer. Personally, I like to use new everything, but you sometimes can't do that. And by tightening this in here real good and tight, that seats the bearing and the housing and all of that good stuff in the case. One of the things I do quite often is I'll use a wrench on a screwdriver to get these good and tight. And I take them out with an impact driver, so that gives you an idea how tight they really need to be. They need to be very tight. So now we have the main drive, we have the main shaft with all of its gears installed. And now we need to install the countershaft gear assembly. Now, this one is a mix and match setup again. This is the main drive gear is, let's see, the main drive gear I want to say is early 77 or earlier because it uses loose rollers. This is a later countershaft gear because it uses pressed-in caged rollers. Okay, that's the way it is. We have a spacer goes here, and this whole thing slides together. Now, in a perfect world, I would be replacing this shifter dog, although it's not bad. And I might replace a few other things, but we're not doing that. One of the things to look at is this is the speedometer drive gear, which has to be pressed on because most gear sets come without it, and you have to install it. So, that being said, we're going to install this main drive gear. I want to show something here real quick. These are the bushings that the countershaft sits in, and they get worn. Now, when you set the end play of this whole gear when it's installed, you can get these spacers in full sets, different thicknesses, so that you can set the end play of that counter gear. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this counter gear and we're going to set it in place. Kind of like that. Now that's not too hard to do. The only problem is I now have the sprocket in the way. So we're going to take the sprocket off, which is why I put it on loose. I knew I'd be putting it on and taking it off repeatedly. Now we can drop the countershaft right in there. Now if those bushings are worn out, pressing them in and out is quite an operation. But once this counter shaft is in here, not too hard to slide this spacer in here. Well, if we're lucky. Once it slides into place, well, we're home free. I think I slid this shaft in a little too far. All right. Fine, I'll take it out. And in a perfect world, we can get this spacer in here. But I tend to think that we have a problem. And the problem here is that this bushing is falling out. Now, those bushings are pressed in and they are tight. They should not fall out. But again, this case is kind of the eighth wonder of the world. So we'll get it in there anyway. Again, just for demonstration purposes. And, well, we're not going to go any further right now because the case is falling apart on me. That should do it. That should do it. Okay, we're going to keep going. And I'm looking in there to see that spacer, and I can see it, and it's really got some issues. So we're not going to be able to do this with this broken case at this time. But there it is, with both main shaft and counter shaft in place. I say in place. There it is. And you can see what the whole gear set looks like installed. Okay? Now, before we go any further, we're going to stop right here. And in our next video, maybe we'll show how to set those dogs. So what I'll do first is tighten all this up, and we'll go over it again, and then I'll show how to adjust the shifter forks for these dogs. So until then, I hope you enjoyed this, watching me fool around with something that really wasn't worth fixing. But I thank you for watching anyway. I hope you learned something from it. And next time we'll see about setting the shifting forks. Then we'll get back into that Evo motor. So until then, see you out on the road.